the lands of the Boonwurrung and Woiwurrung people of the Eastern Kulin Nation. And my co-host today is 𝗤𝗏 Hart, who is about to wave, I think.
Hi, everyone.
So we're going to introduce the session, the reasons for this session, introduce the speakers, and then, we'll have some questions. We have done a pre-record with one of the panelists, Tim Buchanan, who wasn't able to be here this morning. It's a really exciting interview, so we're going to play parts of that each time we ask one of the questions before we go to the two panelists as well. So there'll be a little bit of kind of like moving between different technologies, so bear with us. I hope that it works okay. I just thought is there anything else, Maz, that I forgot to mention before we get started?
Sure, so just thank you everyone for your patience, and with the Zoom change, we're not quite sure what's going on, but we're trying to work it out, and thanks everyone for your patience and generosity, and we're glad that everyone's on. Hi, my name is Maz, and I'm co-facilitating with Peter, and we might just, we've run over at the housekeeping stuff. Just in terms of accessibility, we have been not able to make live captioning happen, unfortunately, for this workshop, but we're going to be recording and then captioning the recording, which will be posted up in the next week or so. So just as a heads up for transparency, we're hoping to have live captions for the future if we do events like this again. This event is free, but as part of the whole counter conference, we're encouraging people to pay the rent. So the Pay the Rent Collective is an autonomous organising collective where people can pay the rent towards the First Nations peoples of the land they live on, and autonomous grassroots First Nations groups. So we have a link. We'll have a link on the website, and there'll be a link in the chat for people to make a contribution and to, if you're able to, sign up regularly. And then also there's going to be some crowdfundings and fundraisers that the panelists might mention, and that we're creating a list of that people can also donate to as well. Accessing the whole conference is free. Just thinking any other tech stuff.
Maybe just if anyone has any tech issues, put it in.
If you can. Get in touch with 𝗖cie. Thank you very much to 𝗖cie and Anne-lise who are helping us with the tech moderating at the moment. So if you have any tech issues or questions, feel free to send a message through to them in the chat. And thank you to everyone who's logged on and who's helping. Cool. All right, well, maybe we'll start now if everyone is ready. We'll start. So thanks everyone, and welcome to the Policing 101, Why Police Are Not Our Friends panel discussion. It's part of the Beyond Mining, Protecting Land, Water and Life counter conference to the IMAC Mining Conference. We'll start with acknowledging the country that we're on. So this organising and this workshop has been organised on the lands of the Wiradjuri, the Wiradjuri and the Boonwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation, on their unceded lands, and sovereignty has never been ceded, and resistance to colonisation is ongoing, and that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and that there can be no climate justice or environmental justice without First Nations justice, land rights, decolonisation. And we'll be going into these things more in this discussion. Thank you very much to everyone who's coming. We're just going to give a bit of an introduction to why we're having this session and some of the thinking behind it. And then we're going to go into introducing the panelists we have here today who are going to be having a conversation. And then we'll jump in, and then there'll be a conversation with those panelists for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers to the panelists afterwards. Okay, where are we going? Okay. So at protests against the International Mining and Resource Conference, IMARC, many people have witnessed or experienced police violence and repression. from those who've been capsicum sprayed, injured or arrested on the day, to those who've been raided or home visited by police, arrested and or surveilled in the weeks, months and or years following. For some people, this has been their first experience of police violence and or repression. And for many people, especially Indigenous people and other people of colour, queer and trans people, sex workers, people experiencing homelessness and people in poverty, police violence, criminalisation and repression happen every day and are constant threats. Following previous IMARC protests, many activists have understandably wanted to denounce the police violence and repression, but sometimes do so in ways which frame the violence as exceptional or excessive and position protesters as innocent, peaceful, and therefore undeserving of this violence. Implicit in this narrative is the belief that there are acceptable levels of police violence, right? And that there are bad people, violent people, criminals, etc., who do deserve to experience that violence. At the same time, some environmental activists have at times publicly encouraged and welcomed collaboration with police, or have positioned police as potential allies in the climate struggle. Such optimistic statements belie relatively privileged experience vis-a-vis policing, so white privilege, class privilege, and have been criticised for legitimising the role of police and reinforcing the idea that they are an essential or desirable institution that can be reformed or made better. It seems to us important to contextualise people's experiences of police violence and repression within a broader understanding of the history and the function of police as an institution designed to protect the colony, the state, and private property. I'll hand over Peter to do the rest of the introduction.
Thanks, Maz. And it also seems to us important to make links between the police and the criminal justice system's oppression of First Nation communities in Australia and mining and resource sector interests. The massive and long-standing overrepresentation of First Nations people throughout our criminal justice system in arrest stats, incarceration rates and deaths in custody is well documented, as is the key role of police in maintaining it. Yet not enough mainstream attention is paid to the links between this criminal justice oppression and the vested interests of the mining and resources sector, and in their desire to continue to extract resources from this land unabated. First Nations people have been at the forefront of fighting extractivism in Australia. And as lifelong Gunnai Mara activist and movement elder Uncle Robbie Thorpe has famously pointed out, it is no coincidence that whole generations of potential armies of Indigenous activists are criminalised and locked up in prisons in this country. 𝗳𝗑ie 𝗳𝗀, a jock scholar and organiser in the 𝗣𝗶𝗰𝗶𝗀𝗀 anti-uranium campaign, in her recent Black Fire lecture with the Melbourne School of Discontent, there's a link going to go into the chat and page, discussed the role in history of the mining industry in repeatedly undermining and sabotaging land rights movements and the cultural resilience of First Nations communities. In this panel discussion then today, we're hoping to explore the relationships between policing, settler colonialism, capitalism and other structures of oppression, and how these are connected to the processes of extractivism, mining and climate collapse, which we are seeking to dismantle. We hope to explore how our movements can imagine, fight for and build a world beyond police and beyond these systems of domination, and how we can deepen lines of solidarity across these deeply interconnected terrains of struggle. So I'll hand back to Maz now to introduce our really exciting panelists that we have today.
Thanks, Peter. Great. So, yeah, with that grounding, we'd like to introduce our panel, which we're really honoured to be joining and holding this discussion. So Meriki Onus is a Gunnai and Gunditjmara organiser and co-founder of the Warriors of the Aboriginal Resistance. Tim Buchanan is a Wiradjuri activist and artist and organiser with the Australian Student Environment Network, ASN. And Anne-lise Ah-fat is a settler and organiser and co-founder of the Undercurrent Community Education Project, Transformative Justice Network, IRL Infoshop, IRL Prisoner Letter-Writing group. And so Tim was not able to be here live, but we've done a pre-recording and that will be woven his responses and recording will be woven into the conversation today. And yeah, so now I'll hand over to Peter to head off.
Hi, thanks. I'm just trying to get the video back up. One of the things I was worried about was that it might fail during trying to do the Zoom at the same time. I'm just going to give it another go because it is struggling a little bit. Sorry, everyone, just bear with me a moment. And if I can, okay. And I'm hoping, okay, I've got that going now. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. Can everybody see this video now? And let me know if the sound is not working. I'm just going to play the first question where Tim introduces himself and then answers the first question for the panel.
Thanks everyone for tuning in, and welcome to the Policing 101, Why Police Are Not Our Friends panel discussion and workshop as part of the Beyond Mining, Protecting Land, Water and Life conference, counter conference to the IMA to 2020. We're really happy to have Tim Buchanan here as part of the panel discussion, and I'll hand over to Tim to introduce yourself before we start.
I'm a Wiradjuri artist, activist. I was raised up on 𝗣𝗶𝗰𝗶𝗀𝗁 country in and around 𝗣𝗨, and I spent the last part of a decade on 𝗣𝗶𝗶𝗰𝗶ₛ country in 𝗬𝗂, Newcastle, biggest coal port in the world. And I've been involved with fighting fossil fuels, refugee rights campaigns, anti-𝗖cie on refuge, all that time, and was really involved with IMA last year. Encountered the police directly and had some pretty intense stuff go on. I do also have in that a history in remand, have carceral systems really affecting my family and my own connection to my culture, to my own family. So these issues and the intersection of them, sort of extractivism, policing, carceral systems, prison industrial complex, are really sort of embedded in my life and my history, and going forward as well, I think. I'd also like to say that, you know, my thoughts are my own. I'm not speaking for or representing any communities or groups here. If you want to know what mob think about certain issues in certain spaces, go and speak to your local community and engage locally. It's really important when you're listening to people like me, or, you know, who are not homogenous. The imperative is to seek out your local community if they want that, and talk to people. Yeah.
Thanks heaps, Tim, for that grounding. So maybe we'll jump into the first question, kind of just to open up in kind of what your thoughts are around the nature, the function, the history of police and the prison industrial complex in so-called Australia, just to kind of open that up before we start to look at the connections with extractivism.
The nature of it, I mean, I don't want to go too heavy into the historical sort of stuff because someone else may be covering that. There, from the get-go, policing was used as a means to dispossess, kill and massacre, you know, people across this continent. Upon invasion, interestingly enough, the army really wasn't used because that was seen as sort of maybe an admission of being at war. So there was this internal policing force that was key to dispossession and sort of that genocide and removal of families, stolen gems. You know, I know I'm breezing over this because I think that maybe it's been talked about quite a lot, and maybe some of the other panelists will cover that. But it's really essential to what we see today in this sort of overrepresentation, tough on crime politics, and conservative governments using tough on crime political campaigns to win electorates, even when we know tough on crime sort of ideas don't particularly work, they don't have the outcomes that are promised. And it's been really centred in terms of illegalising protest activity, and people just standing up for their own country, for their own communities, for their own right to clean water, and, you know, a livable continuation of culture. So that's where it's at. That's how it works. It's a main arm of the colonial sort of program that we're all under.
Okay. I'll just, stop sharing that screen now. And what I thought I'd do now is throw the same first question to the panelists, and maybe for you first, Meriki, just to have a think about some opening thoughts on, you know, your reflections or thoughts on the nature of policing and the history and function of policing, and or the prison industrial complex more broadly in so-called Australia.
I'm on mute. I'm unmuting now. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks, Meriki.
Firstly, I just want to explain that my camera isn't working, so I apologise. And I'm speaking from Wiradjuri country, and so just want to pay my respects and also thank the organisers of this amazing conference. I think you've done a wonderful job. The program is amazing, and we've been giving it a good rave on 3CR. So a real big thumbs up to the organisers of the conference. So yes, the relationship between the resource extraction and policing goes hand in hand. I think it's a perfect formula for colonialism. We're controlled by prisons and policing and the prison industrial complex as a form of dispossession from land. Because of that dispossession, we are disempowered to look after our country. And that's, you know, that's why my argument is that Aboriginal sovereignty is the best protection for Aboriginal land. So that's my view on that. And, you know, a lot of Aboriginal massacres and police violence is a form of dispossession, colonial dispossession, and so is prisons, and so is land destruction. I just wanted to point everyone's attention to the Coniston massacre. That was a state-sanctioned massacre, and that happened in 1928. So that's very, very recent history for us. That happened in the Northern Territory, around a cattle station. So that sort of really gives you a really good example of police violence it's not a good example, it's a striking example of police violence in order to control the conditions of life of Aboriginal people in this country. Those people are still alive, the people that did that. They very well could be. So, you know, that's quite shocking, but, you know, I think, yeah, the dispossession of Aboriginal people off country goes hand in hand with the destruction of our country, you know, with the police. And I just want to also point to the recent police violence on Djab Wurrung country, and how swift and extremely violent it was, and they took everyone's possessions. So yeah, they're a tool of the coloniser, the police. They are not our friends. I wanted to just also raise some environmental groups that have actually quite explicitly said that they thank the police officers and giving the police props for their role in climate protests. And, you know, that's quite offensive and unsafe. That's an unsafe practice for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and many other people who are largely targeted by the police. So that's a risk for us. And when you collude with the police in your climate movement, that's essentially white supremacy. So I think that people need to really look at the intersections between climate and Aboriginal land. You know, I think it's something, correct me if I'm wrong, something like 80% of the world's rainforest is on Aboriginal land across the world. So, I mean, if you want to talk about climate, it's interchangeable. So sovereignty for First Nations could quite literally save us from the brink of extinction, ourselves and humanity. So, and to say that it's a separate issue is essentially white supremacy, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Meriki. So many good points that, yeah, I think we'll have a chance to follow up and tease out as we go through today. I might throw to you, Anne-lise, because, you know, you've done lots of work in transformative justice and in relation to policing and prison industrial complex. So I wonder if you can maybe share some of your thoughts on just the role and function of police in so-called Australia and elsewhere, and yeah, how we can kind of understand that role.
Thanks, Peter, and thank you to Meriki as well, and to Tim. Firstly, I just maybe want to introduce myself a little bit by starting with saying that I'm on the stolen land of the Wiradjuri and Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation. So I'm kind of in the west of Melbourne, and I want to pay my respects to elders past and present, and to acknowledge the continued resistance the Aboriginal people are doing all of the time, surviving in so-called Australia. I speak from someone who hasn't experienced incarceration, but you know, I am from a family that migrated here. A brown family that has experienced the impacts of racist policing and surveillance. But I am a settler, which means that I benefit from the ongoing dispossession that Aboriginal people face and experience in this country. I think the only things really I would add to what Meriki was saying and with what Tim was saying is that, you know, I think that there's something here around not just how like the state functions, but also in how like we replicate that in our movement building. So I think we kind of have like this idea, or like Jackie Wang calls it like an entitlement of security, and we like use the state to like as a provider of that security. And like somewhere along the line in so-called Australia and like the formation of this like place, like there was a decision made essentially to like divest from like social welfare and invest in prisons and police. And, you know, I think prisons are like not just like an impact of capitalism, but it's like entwined in the dynamics of it. It's like it's like completely embedded, I guess. And so we have like these kind of state functions, but then we have this, we kind of like also grow up in this. Like I've grown up in a world where all I know is prisons and police, and those kind of institutions being who we go to I guess, seek this idea of safety, even though those places do not offer safety or justice. We kind of grow up with that mentality. So it's like all of these things are happening to people, and then we are also replicating those things to each other. And, you know, with what Meriki was saying, like this country, it's just like it's founded on prisons. It's founded on policing. And, you know, dispossession occurred through the, you know, expropriation of land, and continues to do that as well through many ways. And even, you know, if we're thinking about things like the the ways that land is leased to Aboriginal people, and the limitations of native title. You know, Meriki talked about what's happening all across Australia in terms of when Aboriginal people do resist land back. We have extreme police violence and force. And yeah, I think in terms of like that kind of connection between like, yeah, policing and prisons and this country, I think there's like something there too that I want to talk about in terms of like surveillance, which I think is also linked to, I guess, climate activism. So even, you know, in my thinking, even if we like kind of move towards like less kind of like physical incarceration, I don't think that actually makes our society less carceral. I think we're like a really carceral society. So we really need to be thinking about and doing stuff around punishment, like what Maz said in your introduction. We have this thing of like who is deserving of punishment, and we really need to change what our ideas about punishment are and why they're so like entrenched in us that some people are deserving of punishment, and therefore the state, you know, we allow the state to, and the state does enforce that.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Anne-lise. Yeah, again, so many important points there to kind of draw out. And yeah, like I have a background in criminology, and as a criminologist, it just always strikes me as so fascinating how disjoined that discipline is, disconnected from all of these kind of discussions, really. And even though it has an understanding of how people in power construct certain groups as criminal in order to deconstruct the idea that, you know, the people in power are criminal, they still don't necessarily make all of these kind of links that I think is really important. Yeah, so that's why I'm really excited about this session. I'm now going to, I think, play the next bit of the recording. So I'll try sharing my screen again for the next question that we threw to Tim. Okay, that's not the right bit of the screen. Okay, here we go. Hopefully this works.
Yeah, totally. Thank you. And maybe, yeah, just to build on like the points that you raised there about how the police serve colonialism, settler colonialism, extractivism, maybe to just pull out some of those threads in terms of how policing, the prison industrial complex, the carceral state connects and intersects and lands in terms of extractivism, land defense, mining, and broader environmental justice, climate justice, how these things connect. And yes, just some thoughts on that intersection.
I mean, the key, what I really want to focus on today is, we talk about policing, right? But policing is just an arm of a wider set of like legislation and policy decisions and electoralism that really doesn't represent us or even like individual communities. First Nations or not, right? The idea that policing is used to suppress low SES communities, people who don't have a lot of opportunities, is paramount to the system as a whole. It's racialized, but it's also very much like class-based. And those two things need to be, you know, viewed together. One, like, class doesn't supersede sort of what happens to us in terms of First Nations people, but it is really part of the same conversation. When we look at legislative frameworks, particularly around native title, the land rights, history, how when we talk about Labor governments and the fact that mining lobbies underwrote and had a mass propaganda media campaign when land rights was seeking to come through, really speak to the way that any legal modes of standing up or fighting back have really been taken off the table. the legal frameworks for protecting country against mining, against coal seam gas is pretty limited. We've seen again and again maybe people winning in the courts, and then people just re-legislating. Like when we look at the 𝗍𝗫𝗀𝗃 fight, there were some wins there to protect the lake from gold mining. That's on Wiradjuri country. It's a really famous fight. But at the end of the day, the community had a win, and the state government just re-legislated so that their win meant nothing. So when we talk about policing, we really see that, like I personally see it at the back end of a very purposeful legislative framework that benefits, you know, self-interested industry billionaires, and the police come in and enforce those sort of systems. So yes, it's really important to talk about police in terms of boots on the ground and their discretionary powers, and how that is intensely racialized, you know, like public drunkenness, minimum sentencing laws, you know, vague three strikes sort of systems, minimum responsibility of age, of criminal responsibility, all things that really target First Nations communities. But they are decisions that are made politically. And that's sort of where my focus, I think I want to focus today.
Okay. Yeah, I found that discussion of Tim's just then really fascinating, especially teasing out some of the differences between thinking about, you know, the police as an institution and as a culture being really problematic, but actually being part of this, you know, needing to look to the bigger systems of law and legislation and the state that are actually driving a lot of what's happening, obviously, with policing. But yeah, I just now want to throw that same question to the panel, and also just to see if either of you have any particular responses to things that Tim just raised as well. So the kind of general question is like just really reflecting on the intersections between police, the prison industrial complex, the carceral state, and extractivism and land rights, and the climate justice movement specifically. And I know both of you have touched upon that already. So it's kind of just a general open sort of discussion to build on that. Yeah, would either of you like to jump in?
You can go first if you want, Anne-lise.
No, you go, Meriki, then I'll go.
Well, I feel like I touched on it. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. Like you can't have climate movement without sovereignty. And that's something we just keep reinforcing. And it is about the system as well. A lot of, you know, environment movements, not movements, I wouldn't call them movements, but there's a culture and environment that people just focus on policing each other's personal decisions. I think it is about capitalism as well. And I think, you know, this is a system that's functioning together, and that's why you can't simply just focus on the resource extraction. You have to focus on the system that enables billionaires to do that and enables policing to be on the ground. That's why that's all the strategies, and it has to be built around working around that, not just having an Aboriginal person come in to do a welcome to country at the start of your climate march. That's not what we mean when we say so Aboriginal sovereignty has to be centred around climate movement. It's the strategy that's built around the dispossession, you know, because the system is dispossessing Aboriginal people every single day. If we were all freed from prison and had access to the right funds and weren't living in extreme circumstances where we needed to live off the system for welfare, we would have the capacity to take care of our own country, and we would do the best. The best example I could probably point to, and I'm not an expert on it, but I think people should really read up on the fight that the Yindjibarndi put up against Twiggy Forest, and it was a really recent win. And there's so many, you know, fights that have happened because of the strength of First Nations people here. all across this country, and they're really good case studies for anyone that's new to this sort of movement as well. I don't know if that's answered it, but yeah, I just also want to say that I'm not an incarcerated person. I've never been incarcerated either, but my family, you know, my brother's been in and out of the carceral system for the last 20 years. And, you know, so many people in our families are living in prison. So prison isn't an abstract thing in our lives. It's a very real reason why we can't practice culture and kinship in the way that we'd want to every single day that we're alive.
Yeah, thanks, Meriki. Yeah, I think those connections are just so important. And yeah, as a criminologist, I just see time and time again people focusing on overrepresentation as though that's a separate issue from all of the things, that you're talking about. And it just isn't, Anne-lise, any thoughts you want to add?
I think Meriki and Tim have covered so much. I think the only thing I would really add is one of the things that Bell Hooks says around the kind of system that we live in, and she calls it dominator culture. And so, you know, when I think about what dominator culture is and looks like and who experiences it and benefits from it, I think about, like I said again, you know, like we kind of live in a world where it's like an assumption we have that a hierarchy should exist and a hierarchy is natural. And I wonder what it would look like if we lived in a world where we kind of challenged the idea that hierarchy is needed or necessary to like have relationships with each other and live together and live, together in ways that are where, we actually thrive. And I don't know, I think there is just something in this, like the ways that we replicate dominated culture. And in terms of climate movement stuff with what Meriki was saying, I think for those of us that are settlers, like, you know, I think we genuinely really have to do some really hard work around what it actually means to, work alongside and in solidarity with Aboriginal people, and not in a token way. Like, how do we actually build friendships over time and build connections that are deep, and that there's trust there? How do we commit to that? How do we not just have, with what Meriki was saying, like, you know, one person that we ask to come along to do our acknowledgement of country or to talk because they say one particular thing, but how do we grow those friendships so that we actually can build, like, you know, different kinds of social movements together and have connection where we can trust each other and not replicate dominator culture. I think, you know, that's kind of the work that I've been trying to do in terms of, like, you know, when I think about building social movements. And I'm not sure, some people know this, but my kind of activism history, it started in kind of environmental struggles when I was quite young, in terms of forest blockading. But I really moved away from that because I saw a lot of how hierarchy was perpetuated and enabled and replicated. And that's kind of what made me move into working around, like, intimate partner violence and harms, and how we work relationally with each other. And because I was like, wow, like, we can't build movements when we are wanting to essentially, where somebody has to be on the top and everybody else is down the bottom, and that's how we organize. Like, it's just not going to work. Like, we are just replicating the same thing that police line is doing over there, but on the other side to each other. And so that's why I've kind of spent, like, the last essentially 15 years trying to work relationally with people, because I don't know, how do we challenge dominator culture both in the state and with each other?
Yeah, so important.
I just want to build on what Anne-lise is saying. Some of the real failures within the Djab Wurrung fight is that allies have a sense of entitlement, and that they think that they know better, and that they fed into gossip and hearsay and attacked Aboriginal women. And that's not over. That's a very live issue right now. And I have to say that that's not, that has made the fight worse. So people need to know how to do solidarity in these movements, and that your sense of white saviour needs to be deconstructed, and people need to educate themselves on how to be an ally in Aboriginal and land rights movements. Because I have to say, for every 10, we've taken 10 steps back with some of that way that allies have behaved in this movement. And I have to say, I'm very disappointed in all of the wins that we've, and movements that we've created and the relations that we've created. And we've had some really good work. We've done some really good work in the last couple of years in terms of movement building. But, I feel like there's also 10 steps back that's happened as well.
Yeah, agreed, Meriki. And I think, I don't know, I've been thinking a lot about this very thing. And I think sometimes it has to do with how connected settlers are to different things. Like, I think we have the choice of choosing like different campaigns that we work on or different struggles that we decide to go to. So we might decide to go to a blockade for a weekend, but we might not be like connected to that struggle for our life. Like, it might not have this meaning for us. And I think we need, like, as a settler, like, I think we really need to really find that meaning so that we are in that struggle for the rest of our lives. And I think this kind of in and out thing that people do of like, I'm going to kind of do this thing for a little bit and then do this other thing for a little bit and then this other thing, it means those kind of connections and relationships aren't made over time. And the people that do experience the brunt of the oppression, they're there all the time because they're experiencing that. Their country is experiencing that. They have to stay in the struggle. But if you have a choice about what struggle you stay in or not, I think that's really problematic. And I think we need to find whatever that thing is in ourselves so that we don't have a choice. We have to show up. And we have to show up in ways that are deeply respectful and where we're actually committed to building relationships with people and to listening, deep listening, like challenging our own entitlements. And also like, I think we have to like give things up. It's not always that our idea is going to be the idea that somebody like says yes to, like listen. And you might have to do things that like you are uncomfortable to you, or that you were like, oh, like maybe I wanted this thing to happen. But, we like as settlers, we have so much from the dispossession of this country. I'm like, there's things that we have to give up.
Yeah, and also I just say that you won't always understand what's happening internally with our mob.
Yes.
Yeah, and you don't have to understand, and you don't have to act on that. Yeah. You can show solidarity and support without having to know all the ins and outs of our community and the way that we function. And, don't look for the big bad black fella in the corner, because, there's a lot of white supremacy that's played out and anti-blackness in our, the way that allies have brought themselves to the 𝗣𝗯 movement, and it's been really violent. So unpack your need to look for the bad black person and lynch them, because that's been happening. Another thing, I've got a tweet printed out, when you're outraged by something, and this is something that I've been trying to live by more as well, what resources exist around that I can better educate myself around the issue, who is already doing the work around the injustice, and do I have the capacity to offer concrete support and help them? So do you have that real capacity? And how can you be constructive? This is stuff that I'm trying to live by as well. Like, I'm not preaching this to everyone, but I just think, I'm taking a step back from a lot of things lately to just educate myself, and I can't stress enough how important that is.
Agreed. And like, you know, I think oftentimes it means sitting in a place of discomfort. And I think for, you know, people like me who are settlers here, we often get grown in this country to have an entitlement to not feel uncomfortable, actually to feel deep comfort. And so I think feeling uncomfortable by that deep listening is super important. And I'm the same, Meriki. I feel like I'm really taking a step back to try and, I guess, to re-find like the ways in which I want to engage in different stuff around social movements and struggle. I think this year has been really difficult for like a lot of people. And I think there is like a kind of collective grief as well. And yeah, I'm taking a step back to really like think about like, yeah, how, what I want to be doing, how I want to be doing that, and how I want to be listening more, and how I want to be doing things with intention and really like know and be able to speak to that intention, and to also like explore the impacts of what I'm doing too with people. Yeah.
Wow, thank you. Yeah, both of you. That's really kind of explored really well this third question, which, yeah, maybe I'll jump again to the video to see Tim's response to it, but it's really about thinking about those kind of reflections for our activism and movements and things like that. So yeah, I'll try sharing the screen again, see if I can get this working.
Thanks heaps, Tim. Maybe we could, from there, we could look at what you think, kind of given these reflections and thinking about these structural factors and the connections between the criminal system, the police, the border prison and district complex in Australia, and land, defense of land rights, extractivism, these struggles. What do you think, like, that these reflections and things we've been discussing, what does this mean for our organising, our movements going forward into the future, particularly environmental justice, climate justice, movements, activism, organising? What do you think is some of the lessons to be learned, or some thoughts, questions to ask going forward?
It's a tough question because it seems bleak. I am not totally pessimistic, but I think any effective organising is going to be illegalised, straight up. That's usually what happens. As soon as any like sort of maybe slightly legitimate process within the bounds or in the grey areas of the bounds of, like, you know, the law, it tends to be stepped on quite quickly. New legislation is rushed through the parliament. When we talk about, you know, like sort of lock-on devices being labelled as weapons to assault people in Queensland, and activists being charged under that sort of stuff. When we look at like how trespass laws work, particularly with people who might even have native title claims and legal rights, even though, you know, the actual right of those people is paramount here. But when we talk about the legal framework that sits over the top, how rapidly that changes and how many caveats sort of quickly get pushed through to make it illegal to occupy, to set up camp, to say no, to do the things that we sort of have relied on in the past, like blockading, occupying space and organising on the ground. That's often in terms of like using the idea of private property, fencing off, and making just simply being on country illegal. We've seen that maybe up at the Adani campaign. We've seen that at Devon Creek. The Gupperung sort of fight is ongoing, and how police were used in tandem with like COVID laws and legislation to find people who are out there fighting for country. it's pretty complex in terms of the way law and legislation is used and how quickly things can get pushed through the parliament to legalise effective modes of resistance. So what we're going to see more in the future is more cops on the ground. We will probably see more sort of abusive tactics and things. The grey areas around like the use of batons and OC spray, like chemical weapons. They're supposed to be used in defensive manners. We saw it at IMARC last year, really, and we've seen it. We see these videos pop up online of like, you know, our communities getting maced and stuff like that when they're being used as an attack weapon. It's not how they're supposed to be used, but we don't really see that sort of stuff getting rolled back. What we see is an expansion of police powers, particularly in Victoria, down here, and we don't really see much of we see a pushback, but not necessarily a legal one that would work, not a legislative one. There's lots of people saying, no, this is not okay. We don't want robocops on our streets targeting our communities. We don't want COVID fines to massively focus on, you know, migrant and First Nations communities overwhelmingly. Like, we can see the racialized elements in the statistics, right? And I think that's just going to increase, personally, because it's really related to class dynamics as well. Like people in vulnerable communities, that's where it's all focused at. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, given both of you already talked quite a bit about the implications for our movement, I wonder though, just if either of you want to add to anything or respond to anything that Tim just talked about.
Meriki?
What was the question again?
So the question that we posed to Tim just then was about the kind of like implications of the sorts of things we've been talking about for our movements going forward, like particularly in relation to climate justice and enviro movements. And yeah, Tim obviously talked a lot about the ways in which we need to think about, you know, laws that give police more powers and that kind of stuff, and being prepared for that. But yeah, I just wondered if you had any more thoughts on that topic in general, or anything to respond to in relation to what Tim raised.
Look, I know the house is on fire. Like, it's really, really on fire right now. But I was born into a house on fire, and the house has always been on fire for us. Mm. And I've never, you know, seldom do we get the opportunity to go back and educate ourselves. So while I know that the house is on fire, but it's always been on fire, I've taken a step back to educate myself a little bit more after realizing how much I don't know. So that's kind of where I see things happening at the moment. But yeah, it is an interesting contrast of how they've used COVID. They've fined everybody $5,000 at 𝗣𝗯𝗯. I think there was, I can't remember how many fines there were, but there were so many fines that were handed out, and they were $5,000 each. And Dan Andrews attacked the camp the same day that they announced the restrictions easing in Victoria. And it was one of the most strangest emotional times for us to see, having seen that tree being chopped down right when we were let out of, you know, 8 months of hard lockdown. Very emotional and strange place to be. And I'll also say, you know, what's been used against us in this fight is that we don't have a connection to that country. And, you know, that's my matriarchal line, 𝗣𝗯𝗯. And the amount of times I've had settlers and even my own Aboriginal counterparts tell me that I'm not 𝗣𝗯𝗯, I don't have a right to it, when actually the reason I'm dispossessed from 𝗣𝗯𝗯 is because I'm an Aboriginal woman, not just an Aboriginal person, I'm an Aboriginal woman, because I have stronger connections to my patriarchal lines, which is, that's a product of colonialism. And while we're moving forward, the intersection of also intersectional feminism has to play a role in these movements as well. I don't know if I've answered the question. I just went on a rant.
A wonderful rant. Very important.
Your turn, Anne-lise.
I'm a bit confused by what the question is too.
It's mainly just thinking about, talking a bit more about the implications of all these ideas for our movements going forward, which I know you talked about already. So yeah, either adding to that or responding to anything that Tim raised.
Yeah, I think in terms of some of the stuff that Tim was talking about, like I remember when I was younger and there was the S11 protests, and I remember the war on terror laws soon after that were enacted, and state repression on protest. And I remember being that age thinking about, I think I was 17, and I remember thinking this is going to have such a deep impact on I guess things like protests in so-called Australia, and I think, you know, these, like, there's always been laws like this, but I think it just kind of, things just kind of move and shift in laws to like suit the era of the time or whatever. But we just it's like institutional that in so-called Australia to like repress protest and resistance, and it's very intentional, and like it works. It has the impact that it desires. So I guess I don't, when I'm thinking about like organising, like I don't look to the state for help in that, because it's not what it's designed for. It's designed to quell that. But yeah, I'm not sure if this is the question where we're going to talk about like, can we imagine difference? Is this
what I might do now actually is build on what, to move into that, to build on what you were just talking about, especially that point around, you know, if we know that the police are going to be given more and more powers, or, you know, they continually seem to be in relation to this stuff, the more that we start to resist or keep resisting, the more, you know, these powers get enacted, like Tim was saying. And what you're sort of suggesting around like not looking to the state to solve that, you know, like I think on the one hand we need to resist those laws coming into play, but we also, it seems, need to do more. So yeah, the next question is kind of thinking a bit more about you know, abolition, transformative justice, decarceration. So I actually wondered, Anne-lise, if you might be able to just explain, because a lot of people here might not be familiar with what abolition is or what transformative justice is, whether you might just be able to talk, like explain those for people a little bit before we then talk about that question a bit.
Oh my God. I feel like it's a lot to explain. But, maybe in my version of things, well, like abolition, I guess, is working towards trying to have a world without these things, without like a carceral system, so without prisons and police, but also without all of the institutions tied to that, right? So surveillance, child protection, social workers, all of the kind of, I guess, the word, things that are linked to all of that. So working towards, having a world without those things. And, you know, I think the kind of, and I guess the history of where this kind of stuff comes from, I want to say this all comes from Aboriginal people, Aboriginal struggle. So the ideas of like resisting the state, of and this is across the world, of resisting the state and trying to like create different communities and I guess social movements without like these things. All of that comes from people that are already experiencing the brunt of the oppression, because they've had to do that work. So they've had to build their families and build their neighborhoods and communities in ways where they don't rely on the police, to seek safety, because that's never offered them safety. And so I think we have a lot to learn from Aboriginal people around the world, and also people of colour around the world who experience the criminal legal system in a way that has lifelong and intergenerational effects. But one of the things that many communities across the world have done, which I guess in one way is labelled transformative justice, but also what that looks like is different for all communities, you know, we don't have to label it transformative justice. It is just a way that people are trying to, I guess, navigate, figure out ways to not go to the police, ways to ensure that their families trying to not have their families going into prisons, and it's based on the work around when somebody causes harm to somebody else in their communities. So, you know, often our first kind of reaction is to call the police, and so a lot of transformative justice work is around are there other things that we can be doing, other ways that we can support people experiencing harm, and also ways we can work with people who are using harm in their communities to heal, to provide safety and support, and to work with the person causing harm to challenge their, I guess, entitlement thinking that like gives them the permission or gave them the permission to use violence. And that looks like all different things and ways that people do that work, but it is very much based on communities of colour across the world who have had to do it. So they can't call the police because the police will come and arrest their family member, and their family member will end up in jail. And, you know, and we saw that, right, with the Northern Territory intervention. So we saw this idea of like, you know, connecting Aboriginal communities to child sexual abuse, and based on, you know, we know what that was based on, white supremacy, and using the military to further dispossess people and to police Aboriginal communities. And at the very same time, we have like those same amounts of child sexual harm happening in Kew and Toorak, but we don't have the military rolling into those suburbs to deal with child sexual abuse. So the ways in which even the state kind of uses, you know, intimate partner violence and harms caused within families in different ways. So some families are policed and are profiled, and other families are causing the same amounts of harms, or people are causing the same amounts of harms and not experiencing state repression in that way. And so, yeah, the work is to kind of address the harms that we may cause to each other, particularly intimate partner violence and child sexual abuse, so that we're able to, yeah, be in these communities together in safer ways. Yeah, especially when we're like thinking about that these things are also connected to dominated culture. So, you know, we're also enacting the same things that the state is enacting on us and on land. We are also enacting on each other. Yeah.
Thank you. Such great explanation. And so important, I think, because, you know, when we realize that police are not our friends, you know, I think it's often so hard for so many people to imagine what else we could do, like how else we can actually deal with issues that arise. So the more I think that people can start to see transformative justice in action and understand it, or whatever it is called, as you said, I think people will be able to start imagining and then enacting alternatives. And I think that, yeah, is so exciting. And maybe we might be able to put up some links to transformative justice stuff. There's some really good YouTube videos available that explain it really well and give good examples, and some really good examples like of Undercurrent here, but also, you know, you've been involved in it. Yeah, if you can start to see how it works, I think that can be really useful. So yeah, we'll try and put some links in, but otherwise look stuff up on the internet, everyone.
Yeah, and even in terms of the conversation we're having today, like I really completely do value like frontline activism. Like I think people need to be doing that. People need to be, you know, putting their bodies on the line in that way. But I think equally we need to value mutual aid and care, and creating communities where like care is valued, not just putting your body on the line at a protest. And I think if we continue to like only amplify that as the only only way to do social movements, then we're not ever going to create communities and social movements that people want to be in for the rest of their lives. Because as Meriki said, the stuff going on at 𝗳𝗏𝗯𝗃, people are going to leave those movements. And so how do we actually build social movements that we can be in for our whole lives, and to do that we have to value all of the different ways that people resist, and you know, not just
Totally. And a world beyond policing and a world beyond capitalism becomes so much more possible when you can actually start to build what alternatives look like mutual aid and like transformative justice. Yeah, Meriki, go.
And I'll just build on that. I think education, it has to go, you know, mutual aid and care, frontline activism or organising, and education.
Yeah, totally.
It's just, yeah, highly, sometimes it just doesn't, it gets overlooked because the house is burning, but we've got to really, you know, focus on the education and information aspect.
I know, collective reading groups. Join a reading group, everybody. Inform yourselves and learn, reflect critically and challenge your ideas about the world.
Yeah, so
and
important.
That will challenge you, not just reaffirm you. Because
yeah, and even though this struggle is really urgent, needing like working out how to slow down so that you can actually do this stuff effectively and well. And sorry, go.
Like when there's things going on in like different protest things, and then like a harm is caused in that community, and like the people call the police, and I'm often just like what are you doing? Like no, like all of these things are like intertwined. We need to learn how to respond to harms caused so that we can be in the protest, and also if the harm is caused, we know how to respond to it and know how to support people experiencing that harm and not call the police. But like in the context that we live in, I would also support calling the police if that's what somebody wanted to do in order to increase safety for themselves, for sure. But let's individually, but as like people working together in our movement creations, we really need to be like challenging that, and really thinking critically about what that actually means for like who is being policed and like who is then having the increase of harm, I guess.
And actively building those alternatives so that we have other ways of keeping each other safe and looking after each other.
Yeah. And how do we like, I don't know, I guess try and not harm each other.
That would be good. So I might go to the next section from Tim's interview, but I'm aware that we are also approaching the 11 o'clock original finish time. What Maz and I are proposing though is that we continue the panel discussion and the last bit of Tim's interview up until 11, but we do want, we're really aware we want people to be able to ask questions and stuff. So we're hoping then that some of you might be able to stick around a little bit longer to then have a bit more of a discussion. Meriki and Anne-lise, are you able to stay a little bit past 11 or do you need to leave at 11?
I have to go.
Okay.
Yeah, I have to go too.
Okay, so maybe then we won't play the rest of Tim's just yet. Maybe while you're both here, we'll now open it up to some other discussion, and maybe while people are thinking of questions they might want to ask in the chat box or putting up their hands, do either of you have any sort of closing comments or thoughts or suggestions you want to make for everybody?
No, Andy A said frontline care education. That's, you know, really just sums up everything we talked about. And, you know, I can't, you know, reinforce again how violent the police are in our community. You know, even at the IMARC blockade last year, we were like talking about the police violence, and then some of the people on the front line were like, don't say that to the police. And we're like, what the fuck? You know, yeah, I don't know, just decolonise your perceptions around who the police really are and what role they actually play. And, you know, it just exposes the privilege that you carry within the spaces as well.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I think so too. Like, and I guess, I don't know, because I grew up with my dad being police, I've never understood like thinking of the police in a positive way. So I really don't get it. I'm always like, what? Like the police, what? And like, they're really not going to do anything for you that you possibly think they might do for you. Like, but I think, yeah, for me, maybe as like a final comment, I think we really do need to like, yeah, detangle ourselves from like what we think police do and like really map that. Like I know, like Lauren Caulfield does like a lot of amazing work around like beyond policing. And like one of the things that she asks is, what do you think police are actually going to do when you call them, and what do you want to happen? And do the police actually do what you want them to do? And it's no, they don't do what you want them to do. So the things that you want to happen, how can that actually be, how can we build our community so that that happens? So then we don't need to call the police for the things that they don't do. And I think that's really worth doing in like your friendship group, in like your social scene or social circle or your collective or your new reading group that you're going to start. Really mapping like what it is that you would call the police for and why, and like how you're going to build your community so that you're getting those things that the police aren't going to do for you anyway. And I think we also need to, like Maz kind of started this with this thing around like our ideas of who deserves punishment, and what Meriki said, we really need to decolonize like who we believe deserves punishment and the idea of punishment itself. And you know, all of the ideas of punishment are racialized, right? Like we grow up in a context in the world where we think Black men are scary, and we really need to change that and what that means for how we are in the world, because it's so problematic. Like it's so problematic. And you know, we also grew up in a world where we racialize Black and brown women to be angry and scary, and
corrupt.
Yeah, what that means for our movements. Like so many white people are so scared of me, and I'm like, fuck off. So decolonize like what you think about people of color, Aboriginal people. Challenge like your ideas of like who people are and your expectations of them, and like humanize people so that you can actually work with people, hopefully for your whole life, that you don't just leave these movements, that you're committed to it.
Yeah, so important. And yeah, it's so important to see that role that the media has, and the mainstream media has, you know, in conjunction with the, you know, the mining sector and the state interests in constructing people in certain ways. And yeah, just being really critical of those constructions is really important. And I liked what you were talking about, building community, Anne-lise, and building like your local street community can also be somewhere to start. Like getting to know your neighbours and knowing you can call on them if something's going on is a really useful thing to do too. Now Carol in the chat box has said they like the idea of a reading group, and can we suggest some books? Absolutely. I think, yeah. Maz?
So yeah, because I'm aware that we're running out of time, and wanting to respect everyone's time. Yeah, like we will definitely have as part of the transcript that we make a list of all of the educational resources that people have referred to, and some of our helpers have put some of those things in the chat now, but they'll be, just because there's too many to name within whatever time we have left. So we'll put more information about further resources, educational resources, and the whole transcription of this in the coming weeks.
Yeah, up on
and
the
just to really
Blockade
thank
IMARC website. Yeah.
And sorry to butt in. And yeah, just to really thank, well, maybe if we could really thank the panelists for your time and for coming in and for entering in this conversation and for everything that you've offered. Before we go, to extend our really deep thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, and thanks to Meriki. It's an honour, as always, to be on a panel with you.
Thanks, Anne-lise. I just wanted to quickly make a point. I forgot to make it in the talk as well. I just wanted to pay respects and acknowledge Uncle Ned Hargraves from 𝗣𝗶𝗶𝗰𝗶𝗀 people in Yuwindamu. He was a part of the Blockade IMARC last year, and then the shooting happened of a young walker from his community. And so I just wanted to acknowledge his hard work and acknowledge that he would have been a part of this, and he's very much a part of the frontline work, and this highlights the intersection of how police violence, policing actually stops First Nations from being a part of protecting sacred land. That's all I want to say.
Thank you. Thanks, Meriki. Maybe as we're just about to wrap up, we can let people know that this workshop is part of a broader counter conference that is the Beyond Mining, Protecting Land, Water and Life counter conference. There's going to be another workshop in this policing and repression series later on today that people can attend, which is being co-hosted with MALS, the Melbourne Activist Legal Support Network, who are going to be giving information about police tactics, educating people more about common police tactics, strategies, kettling, etc., and answering people's questions about police powers, and doing some trainings around that. So that's coming up. And then also we'd really encourage people to have a look at the rest of the program for the week. Just lots of links with things that have been raised here in terms of current struggles that are happening, and ways to better understand what is happening, how to collectively struggle and resist, and how to get involved and keep the fire burning. So for the long term. We really thank everyone who's come along today in person, and thanks to Tim also, who couldn't be here, wanted to pass on his thanks and appreciation to the other panelists, and is looking forward to seeing the whole recording. We'll also upload Tim's full recording as well. Anything else, Peter, you'd like to say before we kind of close up?
Yeah, thanks, Maz. Go on, Lise. Yeah.
I think there's something that we kind of touched on but didn't explicitly say, like, how do we make our movements more accessible to all different peoples and bodies and minds, and where people come from, and especially, I do see the kind of climate justice movement to be particularly white in so-called Australia. And so how do we change this, and how do we engage and centre Aboriginal people, and how do we also engage migrant communities, like my communities, in these kind of in these struggles, especially because there's so much complication there around upward social mobility, and what these kind of different ways of being in the world mean to people who've migrated here. But I think there's a lot of work to be done.
And as Meriki was saying, in strategy, not just in word.
Exactly.
Yeah. getting people to understand their privilege and learn when to know how to step back and make space, I think is, yeah, just such an important thing. Yeah, thank you both so much. I'm not sure if you mentioned, Maz, maybe you did, sorry if you did, but there is also, for any of you who'd like to, obviously these sessions are free, but if you'd like to make a contribution, we've got a link up to pay the rent on the main conference website, and some other links to other organisations will go up later as well, so that won't be the only one there, but yeah, it's just a way of putting back perhaps if you can afford it. For anyone who would like to stick around, I'm going to play now the rest of the interview with Tim, for those of you who'd like to stick around. And I think Maz will be here too, and anyone else, and we can have a bit of a discussion after that for anyone who wants to then ask some more questions and those sorts of things. But yeah, I'll let Anne-lise and Meriki go now, and really appreciate your contributions and discussions today. It's been so lovely to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, Meriki. Thanks, Anne-lise. Okay, so I might just, jump on and share my screen now for anyone who can stick around and wants to watch the rest of the interview with Tim.
Thanks so much. Maybe to wrap up, just considering your time, maybe if we could wrap up thinking in your thoughts on how to increase solidarity across terrains of struggle in terms of abolition, transformative justice, decarceration, how to increase solidarity between environmental justice movements, climate justice movements, anti-extractivism, land defence, land rights, and these struggles for a world beyond police, prisons, etc.
Totally. We've really focused the questions here today on the environment, environmental activism nature of it. Really, what I think we need to, that's very important, but we need to pivot and shift towards like an abolitionist intersectional sort of idea of like abolition needs to be at the core of what we do in the environment movement, right? Because we know that like First Nations communities standing up for their own spaces, waterways, cultural sites is going to be increasingly illegalised. What is important to me is the other really deeper factors of the criminal justice system and prison industrial complex here on this continent. I think we really need to talk about and look at the privatisation of our prison systems, the fact that we have the highest private prison population per capita on the face of the planet, that our private prison system is expanding, that there are a few key players like Serco, Serco is really involved in offshore detention and the abuses of people seeking asylum. We've got G4S. I've had really quite intense personal experiences in the prison system with G4S. I know how they operate. I know how intense the private prison guards are. It's pretty heinous stuff that I've been through. And then we have the GEO group. What really concerns me is that we have this model, and post-COVID, we're going to move into probably a decade of austerity, right? Lots of services are going to be cut and privatised. This is going to happen even more so with our prison system. And those austerity modes, when we remove safety nets for everyone, but for our communities as well, it's going to increase the social stresses that lead to sort of criminal activity. We're going to get more people in our prison systems, but also at the same time we have groups like GEO who donate massively to the Liberal Party through groups like the SDA union. We have groups like GEO donating to local council members so they get re-elected in council zones where they might have a new prison. We sort of have this lobbying system and this private prison system that is expanding pretty rapidly. Since 2000, we've had a massive uptick in people in prison, and crime rates have dropped, but we have this increasing number of people in remand. We have an increasing number of people who are being sentences are much harsher, and are spending more time in prison. To me, that speaks to like a profit motive that is expanding within our prison systems, and something we really need to attack now. I don't want to get to an American style prison system. You know, I don't want labour forces within the prison system to expand. We already have prison labour here on this continent. We already have like mega profits being made by state governments from prison labour, where they get paid, you know, from $20 to $70 for a 30-hour work week, while other companies make money off that, while private companies make money off that. That sort of deeper, insidious stuff, I think, needs much more of a light shone on it on this continent, because it does drive legislation. That's what is really concerning to me. Why are we making these legislative decisions to put more people in prison alongside we're privatising our prisons and it's a profit business? That stuff is really obvious in countries like America. It's starting to happen here. I mean, it already has, but it's expanding. And looking at those drivers are really essential to our conversations around extractivism, capitalism, and growth models within abusive sectors. So like fossil fuel sectors, we want to stop that. Climate change, it's affecting our communities. It's affecting everyone. It's affecting First Nations people, Indigenous people more than anyone else. Private prison expansion and prison labour markets are exactly the same. And we need to bring those together. And I'm sure people already are, but I want to see more of it. And that's what I want to focus on, this political model of donation system. And I don't say this just because I think that carceral models should be under the state, but much like 𝗳𝗶𝗶𝗀𝗁 said, who, you know, from Sisters Inside, decarceration is the journey where the end point is abolition. So we need to look at the pillars that are happening now and deconstruct them. We always need to deconstruct them. Right now I'm seeing the prison system in Australia widen with more really insidious capitalist growth models being the driver for that expansion of the prison system, and that's really important to look at.
Absolutely. Thanks heaps, Tim, for that. Is there anything before we wrap up that you'd like to end on? Any last reflections, thoughts, ideas, or questions to the rest of the panel or the participants in the workshop, or just a cheerio?
It's a conversation that I think I want to have, but maybe it's interesting to be on these panels and talk about the risks, the increasing risks that police pose to us as people fighting for country, but as activists and all sorts of people. These measures are going to become even more punitive. Like, we need to have serious discussions on how to break a kettle. Like, what do we do when police charge us? We actually need to have these serious strategic and tactical conversations about how we protect us and our communities. And it might seem really weird and intense, but if you're at IMARC last year, you know definitively that we have to have these conversations. People were hurt, people were trampled by horses. We still need to be there, but we need to talk about how to keep us safe and not be scared off by the risk, because that's the risk that in my eyes, that we need to take. I realize everyone can't take it, but we need to be looking at what's happening in other countries where they are fighting repressive policing regimes and state colonial systems, and we need to take lessons from there. How do we effectively disrupt? How do we blockade? How do we defend ourselves from cops? And we need to develop those strategies, because they're going to be needed as climate change rolls on, and like sort of these societal risk factors around like water. You know, I was delivering water to mob up on 𝗳𝗁𝗶𝗃𝗁 country because they didn't have drinkable water. That sort of stuff's going to become really real for a lot of people, and the police are going to come and try and protect privatised water systems. You know, I can't drink. There's water across the fence. It's on private property by a mass irrigator. That stuff's already happening. The police will already come and like baton you down for trying to stop that. So it's a really difficult conversation because it's quite scary, but we do need to look at it. Yeah.
Thanks heaps. thank you heaps for your time, Tim, and for contributing, being part of the discussion.
That's all right. Yeah, anytime. Keen to watch the live panel after it's broadcast on Wednesday. But yeah, thanks to all the other panelists. Sorry I can't be there. Would have loved to have a discussion and hear your thoughts as well, because I'm sure there's just so many brains on this at the moment, and really like lived experience, and I'm interested in that too. And we've got to centre those lived experiences of people within the carceral system. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone. We're going to wrap up the recording now. Thank you.